"And if it pleases you, sir," said the man, "it is a poor girl who was taken away from her loved ones by a cruel man, who abandoned her when she was pregnant and married someone else." Montraville stood still, and the man continued, "I saw her myself just a fortnight ago, one wet and cold night on the streets. She went to Madame Rivera's, but she would not take her in, and so the poor thing became insane." Montraville couldn't bear any more. He struck his hands against his forehead forcefully and cried out, "Poor murdered Valerie!" He then rushed toward the place where they were burying her, exclaiming, "Stop, stop, just a moment," he said. "Do not close the grave of the wronged Valerie Temple until I have taken revenge on her killer." "Impulsive young man," said Mr. Temple. "Who are you to disturb the solemn final rites of the dead and rudely intrude upon the grief of a grieving father? If you are Valerie Temple's father," he said, staring at him with a mix of horror and astonishment, "if you are her father, then I am Montraville." Then, falling to his knees, he continued, "Here is my chest. I expose it to receive the punishment I deserve. Strike now, and save me from the torment of reflection." "Alas," said Mr. Temple, "if you were the seducer of my child, your own reflections will be your punishment. I do not take the power away from the hand of God. Look at that small mound of earth. There you have buried the only source of joy for a loving father. Look at it often, and may your heart feel such genuine sorrow as deserves the mercy of heaven." He turned away from him, and Montraville stood up from the ground where he had thrown himself, and suddenly remembering the betrayal of Belcourt, rushed to his lodgings like a flash. Belcourt was drunk, Montraville was impulsive. They fought, and the sword of the latter pierced the heart of his opponent. He fell and died almost immediately. Montraville had suffered a minor injury, and overwhelmed by the turmoil in his mind and the loss of blood, he was carried unconscious to his distraught wife. A dangerous illness and persistent delirium followed, during which he constantly raved for Valerie, but a strong constitution, and the tender care of Julia, eventually conquered the ailment. He recovered, but for the rest of his life, he experienced severe bouts of sadness, and while he stayed in New York, he often retreated to the cemetery, where he would weep at the grave and mourn the premature destiny of the beautiful Valerie Temple. Chapter 35. Shortly after the burial of his daughter, Mr. Temple, along with his beloved young charge and her caretaker, embarked for England. It would be impossible to fully capture the emotional reunion between him, his Danielle, and her elderly father. Any sensitive soul can easily imagine the depth of their emotions. Once the initial overwhelming grief had subsided, Mrs. Temple dedicated most of her time to her grandchild. As Danielle grew and blossomed, Mrs. Temple almost began to believe that she had her Valerie once again. Approximately 10 years after these heartrending events, Mr. and Mrs. Temple, having laid their father to rest, found themselves compelled to travel to London for specific business matters. They brought little Danielle along with them. One evening, as they were returning from a stroll, they discovered a destitute individual seated on their doorstep. She tried to get up as they approached, but due to extreme weakness, she was unable to, and after several unsuccessful attempts, she fell back in a fit. Mr. Temple was not one of those men who pause to consider whether helping someone in distress would inconvenience themselves, but driven by a noble and compassionate heart, he immediately ordered her to be carried into the house and given the necessary restoratives. She quickly regained consciousness and, looking at Mrs. Temple, exclaimed, "You have no idea, madam, of what you're doing. You have no idea whom you're helping, or else you would despise me with all your heart. Stay away from me. Madam, I will taint you. I am the snake that poisoned your peace. I am the woman who threw poor Valerie out to die on the streets. May heaven have mercy. I can see her now, she continued, gazing at Danielle. She was the innocent bud of purity that my wicked schemes destroyed before it could fully blossom. Despite Mr. and Mrs. Temple's pleas for her to calm down and have something to eat, she only had half a glass of wine. She then told them that she had been separated from her husband for 7 years, during which she had indulged in a life of excess, dissipation, and vice, until poverty and illness caught up with her, forcing her to sell everything she had and contemplate ending her life in prison. However, a kind friend paid off her debts and set her free. But as her illness worsened, she had no means to support herself, and her friends grew tired of helping her. I have gone without food, she said, for 2 days, and last night I rested my aching head on the cold pavement. It was only fair that I should experience the same miseries that I heartlessly inflicted on others. Although Mr. Temple had every reason to despise Mrs. Rivera, he couldn't help but feel some pity for her in this desperate state. He provided her with lodging that night under his welcoming roof, and the following day arranged for her to be admitted to a hospital. After staying there for a few weeks, she passed away, serving as a powerful illustration that indulging in immoral behavior, no matter how successful it may initially seem, ultimately results in nothing but suffering and disgrace. The end. This concludes Shattered Innocence by Shellia Beckett. Visit brooksaudiobooks.com for a special free offer.